All right. Welcome everyone to another Beef Reproducing Task Force monthly webinar. My name is Vitor Mercadante. I'm an assistant professor here at Virginia Tech and a member of the task force. It's a pleasure, as always, to have you guys join us on the third Wednesday of the month to discuss beef cattle reproduction. And I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded and it's going to be posted later on our YouTube channel. So if you search for Beef Reproduction Task Force on our YouTube channel, you're going to be able to find our channel there, and has all the past webinars as well as all the videos from the 2020 ARSBC meeting that we did. So, a lot of good resources there. I also want to remind you guys that we're on Facebook. We're actually on Facebook Live right now, broadcasting this webinar as well. And we're also on Twitter. So follow us so we can keep up with anything that we do new and all programs that we release. Today, we're going to have our speaker, Dr. George Perry, who is an associate professor at Texas A&M. He's located at the AgriLife Research and Extension Center in Overton, Texas. Dr. George Perry is also one of the founding members of the task force and one of the current president of the task force. So we're happy to have him here discuss management factors that influence reproductive success. I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab on the bottom of Zoom to enter and type all of your questions. And then at the end, we're going to go through as many as we can. So, George.
Thank you, Vitor, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. I'm glad everybody was able to join in this evening or takes the time to watch this over the recording. And as Vitor said, I want to continue our monthly webinar series and talk about factors that influence reproductive success. And so one of the things that really comes to question is, why is reproductive success so important to the beef industry? Well, we were fortunate several years ago to work with Dr. Cushman at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. And we were able to evaluate over 10,000 heifers that all calved as heifers, and then track those 10,000 animals through 9 calvings. So when did they leave the herd due to reproductive failure? And what we can see in these slides is those animals that conceived early as a heifer, so they calved early with their first calf, actually stayed in the herd longer than those animals that calved either the second or the third 21-day period in that first year. Now, it has nothing to do when they calved in subsequent years, but when they calved in the first year, what did that impact their longevity? Not only did they stay in the herd longer, but they also produced more pounds of calf. And so we can see this first year, as you would expect, there's 21 days difference between the first group, the second group, and the third group. So you would expect those differences in weaning weights. But as we carry it out, those animals that calved early their first year actually were still weaning heavier calves all the way through their 6th calf compared to those that calved in the second or the third 21-day period. And so we can see how reproductive efficiency is so critical to the beef industry and profitability of cow-calf operations. So what I want to do this evening is actually break it apart and go through and talk about what is impacting reproductive success and what we need to consider, first off, before we implement an estrus synchronization or AI program. So prior to the start of the breeding season, what do we need to be thinking about? And to begin with, on heifers, the first thing we need to look at is, what were your pregnancy rates the past few years? This gives us an overall picture of what your management is and how your heifers are doing. If you have really good pregnancy rates, just turning out the bull, they breed up good, they're bred early in the breeding season, then you're ready to go, and what you're doing is very much ready to go into a synchronization and AI program. The other things to really consider is, have you used growth promotants in your heifers? Now, I know there's data out there that will go both ways, saying it's okay or that it's not. Usually it's not recommended to put growth promotants in replacement heifers. And the reason for that is is when you're putting in hormones to heifers you're going to use as a replacement heifer, it can actually have negative impacts on the reproductive tract depending on what product you use and when you use it. And so there's extreme variability. And so it's very cautious on doing things like that. Next thing is, have you selected an appropriate target weight? I like to recommend 65% of mature body weight. And the reason for that is when those target weights were developed, looking at 65% of mature target or mature body weight, it was to have greater than 90% of animals cycling prior to the start of the breeding season. So why is that important? We need to know that they're ready to go when the breeding season starts. And that feeds into that last bullet point there of what proportion of your heifers have reached a tract score 4 or 5. These are the animals that have reached puberty and have started estrus cycles. And the reason that's important is some work that was done out of Nebraska actually shows you can develop heifers to a smaller or less mature or less percent of their mature body weight and get along good through the breeding season. But even data from those labs will show you that if you're at that critical point, and the data would say most heifers reach puberty somewhere in that 55 to 60% range, we can see here when heifers were developed at 55 versus 50%, there was 17% fewer animals that conceived in the first 30 days of the breeding season. And so what we want to do is make sure those animals are ready to go and ready to breed at the start of the breeding season. And so that's why that 65% of mature weight, it gives you that buffer zone to make sure they're cycling and ready to go. And a neat study that actually looked at that to follow it up was this study. And what they did was, here's body condition or reproductive tract score 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So these animals are pubertal, peripubertal, and prepubertal. And you can see in that first breeding season, as you would expect, as tract score gets increases, so pubertal animals have better conception rates, better pregnancy rates, they calve earlier, they wean heavier calves. Now, what was interesting in this study is all the animals that conceived and calved, they carried them through to the next year. And what you can see is those animals that were prepubertal at the start of the breeding season as heifers had lower conception rates as 2-year-olds. And those animals that were pubertal had better. And so it really brings up the question, is these animals that are prepubertal at the start of the breeding season, should we really consider keeping them? Or if you're buying replacements, buying them? Or are they just going to cause more problems? And are they going to leave your herd earlier, as our data would show, and therefore end up costing you more in the long run? So to go along with puberty in heifers, we also need to think about what criteria in the cows. And in the cows, as we're getting ready for the breeding season, a lot of it comes down to cyclicity also. What we see here is, what has your pregnancy rate been over the past several years? Same thing as with the heifers. If everything's going good, cows are breeding good, then we know management and everything are good to move into a synchronization in an AI program. But when we break down what specifically we're looking at, what's your body condition score? We want cows to be in a body condition score 5 or more at calving. And the reason that is we know over that first month of calving, most of the energy is going to go to milk production. And so when we add in that lactational effect, we need the body reserves to allow that animal to begin estrus cycles again, have good follicular growth, and maintain everything we need to prepare her to get rebred in that 80-day period so she calves on a yearly interval. When we go into the breeding season, what is the current body condition score? And the reason for having these two so close together is, as you're looking at that, if you're losing a lot of body condition between calving and breeding, we know we're fighting an uphill battle on nutrition to try to get those animals rebred. If they're able to maintain their body condition, then we know that nutrition is good and those animals should be going into a breeding season on a positive plane of nutrition, and going into a breeding season should have good success. How many days postpartum? And this is critical because we know once an animal is calved, there are other things besides cyclicity that can impact things. So about the first 40 days after calving, we deal with uterine involution. With uterine involution, it doesn't matter if she can ovulate, she has a good oocyte or a good egg to be fertilized, but that involuting process can actually inhibit sperm transport. And so those things come into play, and we need to make sure cows are far enough postpartum to have good fertility. We need to look at the length of the breeding season. So a longer breeding season means we're going to have so much variability at the start of the next breeding season, we may need to split our cows into multiple groups to actually get good synchrony on them. And that comes into what proportion of the cows are cycling at the start of the breeding season. And the reason that's important is we need cows cycling if we want to get them bred. So what effect does the anestrus period have? Pure and simple, animals that aren't cycling, whether it's prepubertal in heifers or whether it is cyclicity in cows, if they're not having normal estrus cycles, they can't get bred. Postpartum cows, typically, if they're in good plane of nutrition, anestrus period should be about 35 to 60 days. We do see it run a lot longer if nutrition is on the lower end. And so prolonged periods of anestrus or delayed puberty have a major economic impact in the beef operation, because those animals, if they don't initiate cyclings prior to the breeding season, then our conception rates are always going to be very low. Well, it doesn't matter if it's heifers or cows. One of the things we need to do is actually vaccinate those animals to make sure we minimize the risk of embryonic loss or low fertility. And when we think about what we vaccinate a cow herd for, those vaccines are mainly for reproductive diseases. And so we need to think about what can we do to have the best management to get good fertility in those animals and good immunity. And so replacement heifers, we really need to build immunity into them. We need to start heifers at weaning, really, and get them vaccinated so we have the good immune system built up well before going into the breeding season. Animals that have never been vaccinated should not be vaccinated right at the start of the breeding season. And we'll go into that in a little bit more details, but especially with a modified live, because there's negative consequences that will occur. And both heifers and cows, I recommend, should be about 45 days pre-breeding minimum at time of vaccination. And I'll show you the data on why I recommend that. If we look, this was a study we did a few years ago where we actually took naive heifers that had never been vaccinated before, and they were either given a modified live, a killed vaccine, or a control, so given saline. And we can see the group given saline had no abnormal estrus cycles. The group given a modified live, we see almost 40% of them having an abnormal estrus cycle. Even the killed vaccines were at about 10 to 15%. And so one of the things this study shows us is we vaccinated these animals at the time a CEDAR went in. And so the dogma has always been that a modified live vaccine can get into this dominant follicle and disrupt luteal function that occurs after its ovulation. Well, when we're using modern estrus synchronization protocols, most of those include an injection of GnRH at the start of the protocol. That GnRH will induce this follicle to ovulate. So if the only thing we're affecting is this follicle, it shouldn't be much of a concern. But what we know from this study is that we were also affecting this follicle that was growing during the synchronization period, because we had 40% of these animals had an abnormal estrus cycle. And in reality, when we looked at it, we also had decreased fertility out here at the second service on the rebreeds. And so in a naive animal, if you don't know that it has been well vaccinated, we want to avoid vaccinating them at the start of a breeding season, because we're going to have negative effects. Now the question becomes, in the cow herd that's been well vaccinated, what impacts do we have there? So we've done a couple of different field trials. This was the first one we did, where we had a modified live, a killed vaccine, and saline. And we can see we actually ended up with about 5 to 8% lower AI conceptions in our modified live group compared to our killed vaccine group, and our saline group was intermediate. That carried on through 56 days of the breeding season and also final pregnancy checks. And so we can see there can be negative effects. And in this study, all of these animals were vaccinated 30 days pre-breeding. We wanted to follow that up with another study that we had to range what do producers normally do. And so in this study, animals were vaccinated with either a modified live or actually a chemically inactivated vaccine. So it's still considered a killed vaccine because it won't replicate at body temperature. And these animals were vaccinated anywhere from 27 to 89 days pre-breeding. And when we look, our modified live again had about a 5 to 8% lower conception rate for AI. We saw no difference during the breeding season. But across these two studies, we've got about 3,000 animals and about 19 different herds that we've seen somewhere between a 5 to 8% decrease in conception rates when we're using a modified live close for the breeding season. Now, when I say close before, this is where that timing comes in, because it didn't matter if we used a modified live or the killed vaccine. We can see that if it was given close, so 27 to 30, 31 to 37 days, they had lower pregnancy rates than if it was given 46 to 89 days pre-breeding. Even in the killed vaccine, we saw better conception rates when it was given out more than 45 days prior to the breeding season. Now, why would this have such an effect? If we think about fertility and we think about what we're doing at the start of the breeding season, the egg that is being released actually started to grow about 42 days earlier. So, well, it formed its antrum about 42 days earlier. It actually totally began to grow from our primordial follicles about 90 days earlier. And so from this early antrum formation until ovulation, if we're at 42 days, we can see allowing that entire process to move out before we come in and start the breeding season. And so that's why when I get asked, I recommend people, if they're going to vaccinate pre-breeding, especially with a modified live, that we're out at least 45 days pre-breeding. Now, one of the things we really need to consider in this is no vaccines 100%. And we came across this study kind of by accident. This one was just published in Bovine Practitioners, one of my students, Caitlin Epperson. We were actually doing a study looking at resynchronization. And we were using 9 herds, cows and heifers. They were all vaccinated 30 to 45 days pre-breeding. You can see a range of vaccines that were used. But what happened is 4 of these herds ended up with exposure to BVD by moving cattle around. And so they had some cattle moved onto places at the start of the breeding season. And we know BVD was there as a transient infection because we were actually able to pick up the antigen in blood samples we had during the breeding season. And so we talked about a 5 to 8% loss in conception rates with vaccine. But even more important is here we're talking about a 20% decrease between those herds that actually had BVD exposure versus those herds that did not. And so if we come in, we can overwhelm any vaccine and we can have these negative effects. So biosecurity and testing becomes even more critical. And so the risk factors that your herd is in are very important to how you manage that herd and what the vaccines are actually accomplishing. But we see first service AI a 20% difference. First and second, when we combine both of them, we're at almost a 20% difference. And at the breeding season overall, a 20% difference. So what I like to point out to people is, yes, we talk about in a well-managed herd that is biosecure and stuff, that 5 to 8% difference may have an effect. If we have problems or you're in a risky situation, that 20% is going to have a much greater impact. So it's important that we understand the movement of our animals and what we're exposing them to during the breeding season. So what about add estrus? So we got cows set up good before the breeding season. We know nutrition as well. We know they're cycling. They're ready to go. What are our important parts when we start the breeding season? Well, one of the most important things is estrus detection. Why is that so important? We can't get cows bred unless they're in estrus. And so successful insemination requires that the animal be detected in estrus and inseminated at the correct time. And so those can be two different parts to it, but those animals, when they exhibit estrus, we know the hormones are correct and their body is ready to be inseminated and then for that embryo to begin to develop, to grow. There's several estrus detection aids out there. They do a great job telling us when cows are in estrus. We utilize them even in fixed time AI protocols, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So why is it so important to use something to know when cows are in estrus? I said there was a difference between knowing they're in estrus and the time that we inseminate. This was a study that was done at Colorado State several years ago where they took animals, synchronized them all the same way. Half the herd they did intensive estrus detection on, and this was actually the heat watch system years ago that was computerized at 24 hours a day monitoring, or casual heat detection, so 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes in the evening. And you can see there's a 30% difference in the number of animals they detected in estrus over a 3-day period. What about conception rates? Now remember, conception rates are totally the animals that get pregnant out of those that semen was put into. And so when we look, there's still a 20% difference between these two types of heat detection. Now you may wonder, well, all of them were seen in estrus, all of them were synchronized, all of them were AI'd the same way. Why is there a 20% difference? It's even more dramatic when you put that on a pregnancy rate, because a pregnancy rate, remember, is synchronization rate times conception rate. So this is the number pregnant out of the total number that were in the herd. Lots of people will be happy with 71%. Everybody's upset with 35%. And the only difference here was the amount of labor put into heat detection. So why would you get that difference in conception rates when they were all seen in estrus? Well, Dr. Sacchi did work several years ago looking at the timing of AI and how critical it is. And we know that we try to synchronize, we try to AI animals about 12 hours after that onset of estrus, because that's kind of our compromise. If we breed animals too early, then the sperm life becomes inadequate. We get low fertilization rate, but high embryo quality. The low fertilization rate is because the sperm dies prior to the time that the oocyte is released and ready to be fertilized. If we inseminate too late, we get the opposite effect. The oocyte becomes aged, and there's not much selection on the sperm. And so we get high fertilization rates, but low embryo quality. And if we get out too far, you can see it very quickly drops down. So it's not a true bell-shaped curve. We get out here and we get some very rapid decreases. And so timing, knowing when they show estrus. So if you just go out 30 minutes morning and evening, if that animal's not in estrus this morning, but is in heat this evening, when did she start to show heat? Should she be bred this evening or should she be bred tomorrow morning? And so those become the critical questions and how you're able to manage that. So that comes up with the question, when do cows show estrus? There's multiple different studies in here, but if we look across the average, we can see 26% in the early in the morning, 29% late in the evening. And so when we think about that, there's actually 56% of animals, so over half of the animals show estrus during the nighttime hours. And so we really need to be detecting estrus as early in the morning as we can, as late in the evening as we can, to get as good of heat detection as possible. Now, do we need to worry about it if we're using natural service? Actually, we do. We still need to put some effort in to make sure the bull is doing his job. And that's the thought is, oh, with natural service, it's totally the bull's job. But there are differences between bulls and libido. Poor libido is basically when a bull is not willing to go out and do estrus detection. And it's actually a fairly highly heritable trait. Low libido can practically be measured by watching your bulls. What are their interests? Are they going around from cow to cow trying to see who's in estrus, who's it's time to breed? Or are they more interested in where the feed bunk is or laying in the shade or things like that? And it's really important with older bulls because they will spend more time lying around, but we need to watch them to make sure they're getting their job done. And I was fortunate a few years ago to be on a meeting with Dr. Barth from Canada, who did a lot of work with libido. And he shared these pictures with me that showed these two Charolais bulls. And they had this cow that was in estrus. They would turn them out. And what do you think the two bulls' interests are? Dr. Barth would say that this bigger bull, his semen quality was fine, but he had horrible libido. He never did care to go breed a cow. And so by watching our animals, we can get an understanding and we can understand those animals that have poor libido, because with that, conception rates, even with natural service, are going to be low. Do we need to worry about estrus detection with fixed time AI? I made the comment earlier, even with fixed time AI, we still do estrus detection aids so we know if an animal is going to be in estrus. Now, why is that important? Well, one of my graduate students a few years back, we did a meta-analysis. We looked at 26 different studies that covered all of the fixed time AI protocols that are currently recommended, heifers and cows both, to look to see what impact estrus expression had on fixed time AI conception rates. And what we can see here is in every one of these studies, the animals that exhibited estrus prior to fixed time AI had better conception rates. And in that reality, it was about 27% better conception rates. So think about that, 27 extra cows out of 100 if they're showing estrus prior to fixed time AI. And so that can have a huge impact on the benefits. If you go out to do a fixed time AI and very few animals are exhibiting estrus, something's going wrong. If you go out and the majority of them are in estrus, things are going good. And it gives you a chance to prepare for how good or bad your conception rates might be, or if we need to intervene at the start of the breeding season and step back and say, wait a minute, something's not going right. Let's relook at this and figure out how we can get better conception rates. Why is it important in a fixed time AI protocol? We're giving GnRH, we can induce ovulation, but as we can have shown, estrus expression, that estradiol that starts estrus, actually changes uterine pH. And so we can see this drop in uterine pH among animals that show estrus compared to those that don't. What does that change in uterine pH do? It actually improves sperm transport, for one thing. So it has an effect on the uterine environment. And we can see that among animals that exhibited estrus, there was more sperm that were able to get to the site of fertilization. And we can see that here in these slides. These pictures on the top are embryos that were collected on day 6. And we can see the accessory sperm. And so these top ones, we see 1, 3, about 6. If we look down here at the bottom in these cows that are in estrus, some of those cows had over 100 accessory sperm. And you may ask, well, why does that matter? It only takes 1 sperm to fertilize the egg. Well, that's true, but we want to make sure it is the best possible sperm to be there. We want to get the highest quality embryo we can. And that was the other thing we noticed in this study, was that cows that showed estrus actually had higher quality or more developed embryos and better quality embryos. Remember, a lower score for quality is a better embryo. To also look at that, we did a study where we actually overectomized cows and then transferred embryos into them and wanted to see what role estrogen had on the uterine environment. And so we can see in every group, when embryos were transferred on day 7, they're all considered pregnant. By the time you get out to day 29, the group that had no estradiol exposure, so no estrus at all, there was only one animal that maintained her pregnancy, versus about 21 to 29% in the group that experienced what a estrus would be at the start of the breeding, or at the start of the timing. And so these animals either experienced estrus or no estrus, and we can see when a good quality embryo was put into them, their ability to maintain that embryo. The other thing at the time of insemination that's important is inseminator efficiency. Do we get semen in the correct place? Do we do it at the correct time? And so we know when it's put in the correct location at the correct time, fertilization occurs greater than 95% of the time. And so this means getting it through the cervix and depositing it where semen will go into both horns. We know that when we do this, things are good. We know that if we put semen into the cervix, conception rates go down. We also know that this happens in the studies that have looked at it more than people realize. So double checking and making sure you're putting semen into the uterine body at the correct time is important. So now let's talk about after the breeding, or after insemination if we're doing AI. So now what we're thinking about is we've inseminated those animals, they showed estrus, so we've got 95% that should be fertilized. So now we need to consider embryonic loss. So what goes on with embryonic mortality? Embryonic mortality is really controlled by numerous things. And so we need to consider genetic factors, heat stress, asynchrony between the embryo and the maternal environment, the sire, nutrition, shipping stress, all of those things come into play. And so to understand how all of those things can be managed and what your management can do to impact embryo survival, I want to spend just a minute talking about early embryo development. And so if we look, day 0 is estrus. Ovulation occurs about 30 hours later, so that's when fertilization would occur. We go through cell divisions. That embryo gets into the uterus about day 5 or 6. So the first 5 to 6 days up here, it's spending in the oviduct. Anybody who's been involved with embryo transfer, you know, we usually try to transfer blastocyst embryos, so about day 7. Hatching. But one I like to point out here is day 15 to 17, maternal recognition of pregnancy. So this is the first time that cow even knows she's pregnant. And so it's 2 weeks after she's bred before that cow even knows anything. So any management we do up here before that can have a negative impact on that embryo survival, and that cow never even knows she lost a pregnancy. As we move down, we can see attachment and placentation, definitive attachment, and then finally out to birth. Well, one of the things that comes into play is shipping stress. A lot of times people will AI their animals in one pasture or in a dry lot or that, and then move them later. Well, Dr. Gary up at Fort Keogh has done work looking at when that can impact embryo development. And what he's seen is if animals are trucked soon after AI, so within the first 4 days, see good synchronized pregnancy rates. If they're moved day 8 to 12, now remember, this is right before maternal recognition of pregnancy, we see high levels of embryonic loss, so about 12%. If they're moved around that time of placentation, we can see 9% loss. And what was even interesting is he did a study where they were loaded on the trailer 45 to 60 days after AI. So they actually ultrasounded them, loaded them on the trailer, hauled them, and then they still had 6% loss. And so we can see even all the way out here that shipping stress is a real stress that can have a negative impact. And so we need to be aware of that when we're looking at our pregnancy rates. What about other management stresses? Well, we were kind of surprised a few years ago. We did a study and we had looking at heifer development, and we had developed heifers either out on range from weaning to the start of the breeding season, or they had been developed in a dry lot on a high forage diet. And when grass greened up in the spring, they went out to pasture. And these animals were actually in the pasture together May 18th this year. But we can look to see over this first week what a dramatic change there was in body weight. Plenty of green grass. Those animals that knew how to graze were gaining about a pound a day. Those at first turnout lost over 1.5 kilograms a day for that first week. They were able to bounce back, but they didn't catch back up until almost a month later. Now, what impact can that have on fertility? There's one study that I found that has had that dramatic of a change. They actually purposely changed the diet of an animal from 120% of maintenance to 40% of maintenance. They lost 53 pounds over 2 weeks. So 60% of them stopped cycling within 14 days. So if we can have a nutritional change sufficient enough to make animals stop cycling in 2 weeks, what impact would that have on that embryo that we've just AI'd and we're wanting to get pregnant? So we did a couple of studies looking at that. This first study, there's 5 different herds involved. We had heifers that were either maintained in a dry lot or they had more than 30 days of grazing experience prior to AI. They were all pooled together within herd, synchronized, AI'd the same way, and then turned out in pastures together. In this study, we actually did average daily gains on these animals, so we brought them back. And you can see different herds, it's different, but in every one of the situations, every one of the replicates, those animals that had 30 days or more grazing experience had better average daily gains after AI than those that didn't. So what impact did that have on conception rates? Well, we can see those animals that stayed in the lot, 97% of them were cycling before the start of the breeding season. Those that had been out grazing, 94%, so no difference between those. But if we look down here at pregnancy success, almost 60% conception rates in those that had prior grazing experience, but only 49% in those that got turned out to grass right after AI. And so that 10% difference can have a big impact on how you look at your pregnancy rates. Well, why is this occurring? We put pedometers on some of the heifers, and what you can see is those animals, when they first get turned out to grass, took over 17,000 steps in one day. When we compare that to the group that has prior experience, it took 4 days for them to calm down enough. And so those first several days when they're turned out, they're spending more time walking, investigating their pasture than they are worried about eating. And so remember that embryo, she doesn't even know it's in there. We're having those negative impacts. And so then the question really becomes, can we have a negative effect on conception rates with only a 4 to 5 day change in diet? And so what we did, we took heifers, developed them all the same way. At time of AI, we changed their diet from 120% to about 80% of requirements for energy. We flushed embryos, and what we can see, embryo stage was decreased in those animals. Embryo quality was decreased. The number of cells was decreased. And the percent of cells alive was decreased. So we actually got poor quality embryos that were less developed and had more dead cells in them when they went through this energy restriction for 6 days after AI. Well, if it's really nutrition, we should be able to fix it by supplementing. And so we looked at that. We turned heifers out to grass, and we either totally to grass or grass and supplemented them. And if you look, we could. Those animals that got supplemented had better conception rates than those animals that went to pasture alone. So consistency becomes very important. We want to make sure during the breeding season, from this prior to the breeding season through that those animals stay on as consistent of a plane of nutrition as possible. We don't want anything that can negatively impact it because, like I pointed out, there's 2 weeks that those animals don't even know they're pregnant. They can't signal, they can't change anything that's being supplied to that embryo. And so we want to make sure their diets are staying consistent. The other thing we need to consider is semen. When we think about bull fertility, the first thing that comes to mind is a breeding soundness exam. It's a great tool for detecting sterile and infertile animals. A disadvantage of it, though, is below average or low fertility bulls are often classified as satisfactory. And so when we do a BSE, there's no guarantee that that bull is going to be high fertility. It means that he has the potential to be a satisfactory breeder. And so in that, we need to make sure that we understand those differences that are occurring. And they can be exaggerated when we put bulls out or when we use them in a fixed time AI protocol. So these are 13 bulls when I was up at Fort Keogh that were collected and frozen on the center. And so these are actually ear tag numbers. But then they were used in a fixed time AI program. And we can see these huge differences between the bulls. And under a microscope, they all look the same. And so why can we get such differences when the semen looks good for a breeding soundness exam when we put it into the animal? Well, one of the things to consider is how long we ask that semen to live. When we're doing a fixed time AI protocol, we're actually asking semen to live for extended periods of time. And these are 2 bulls that we used where we actually inseminated animals from 30 hours before the onset of estrus to 30 hours after the onset of estrus. And what we can see here is this one bull, bull 1, did great no matter when we used him. Bull 2, he got a few animals bred here early, but with the recommendation when we get out to 12 to 18 hours after the onset of estrus, he jumped right up, no difference between them. He did great. And so that's when we look at the timing of insemination, how important it is, and how that can vary between bulls. Because when we look down here, we looked at membrane viability, DNA stability, progressive, so percent motile, total progressive under stress, so delayed measurements, no differences between these bulls. And so when we think about that, it's nothing that we can actually measure, but we know it's going on. And so there's lots of research going into these different areas. There's lots of research still to be done looking at bull fertility, but we need to consider that when we think about our breeding seasons. So then how do you determine when something goes wrong? We know what we need to do right for before the breeding season, at the breeding season, and after. But have things go wrong and conception rates aren't where we want them to be, how do we start to troubleshoot things? Well, one of the best ways to do that is through the equation of reproduction. And if you look at how I've laid things out today, it kind of follows along this. Animals detected in estrus and inseminated, inseminator efficiency, fertility level of the herd, fertility level of semen. If all of those are perfect, we get 100% conception rate. We know that never happens. But one of the things with reproduction, and we look across this, if we do good in everything but one area, and we just do okay in that area, how big of an impact does that have on conception rates? Well, we can see if we do 90 to 95% in everything but one area, and we just do okay, say 60%, we drop from 100 to 46% conception rates. And so it goes to the adage, you can do everything perfect if you put dead semen in, or you breed them at the wrong time, conception rates can drop to 0 really quick. And so we need to realize a lot of reproduction is in the details. And so when we think about that, what are the primary problems that are the impact when we don't see the conception rates that we want? And so when we think about that, cattle are, first off, not good candidates. They're in poor body condition score. They haven't reached puberty. They're not having normal estrus cycles. Any of those things and we set ourselves up for poor pregnancy rates. When we talk about AI and estrus synchronization, the other big one comes compliance to protocols. There's a lot of research that is put into the protocols that the Beef Reproductive Task Force recommends. We know those protocols, we know they work in many situations, and when we do that, as long as you follow what is written there, it should work well. What happens though is, especially on fixed time AI, the timing gets off, or we need to change things because life gets in the way. When we change one of those protocols, now we risk not doing things. The other thing that I get calls on a lot is, oh, I accidentally gave GnRH instead of prostaglandin, or I gave prostaglandin instead of GnRH. And so those things become very critical on understanding what happened and making sure you follow the protocol correctly. Facilities, I've seen where this can be a situation. If the facilities are not good in being able to work the animals with low stress and being able to get them through these protocols, those multiple handlings in a short period of time, stress can be very bad on conception. And so we need to make sure we have the facilities to do what we need to do. I talked about shipping stress or trucking stress, management stress, cattle losing weight during the breeding season. You may think about those studies as, oh, well, that was heifers going out at the start of the breeding season from a feedlot to pasture. The same thing occurs if we run out of grass, if we get a drought situation or anything else right around the start of the breeding season. And so we can run into those negative energy balances at the start of the breeding season several different ways. And we know it has a big negative impact on our pregnancy rates. And then, of course, failure to pay attention to details. As the equation of reproduction points out to you, everything with reproductive success is in the details. And so we need to make sure all of those details are followed. We need to keep records from year to year. We need to know what's going on. Because when you do all of that, those are the herds, those are the people who have really good conception rates consistently. A lot of times people ask, oh, is it the product I use? Any of the products that are recommended have gone through testing. We know they work and they are biologically active. So it's usually not one of those unless something has been very mishandled in the process. And so with that, I want to thank all the people that have helped over the years. Lots of research has gone into this, lots of students and collaborators across the country, lots of different people from USDA to companies have funded this research and the work we've done, and lots of graduate students and undergraduates have actually been the ones doing all the work. And so with that, I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions. And so I'll be happy to answer whatever questions we can. And so when I start looking down the list here of what has been typed in, one of the questions says live vaccines at weaning only. That is what we have recommended, or the group I've worked with for several years. If you can get a modified live vaccine into them around weaning and then move to killed vaccines pre-breeding, you can have very good success. And actually what it does is it primes both sides of the immune system and allows you to have both sides really affected. So you can have really good immunity that way and then still avoid the modified lives right at the start of the breeding season. Let's see, next one. When is the best time to AI cows that have long heat cycles, i.e. over 48 hours? So if an animal is exhibiting estrus for extended periods of time, and we've actually done this where we've ultrasounded animals every 3 hours after the onset of estrus, ovulation still occurs somewhere around 30 to 36 hours after the onset of estrus. And so we know those animals are ovulating at that time. So even if they're still showing estrus, that ovulation is going to occur right around the 30 to 36 hours after the onset of estrus. So breeding them still about 12 to 18 hours after the onset is the correct timing. Let's see. What is reproductive tract score for heifers? So reproductive tract scoring on heifers is where you come in, you manually palpate the tract, you feel the size of the horns, you feel the ovaries, and the biggest thing you're feeling for is there a large dominant follicle? Is there a corpus luteum present? Those animals that have a large dominant follicle or a corpus luteum where we know they've already ovulated would be considered pubertal. Those animals that you can feel some follicular growth on, but they don't have what we would consider an ovulatory size follicle or a CL would be that class 3, so they're peripubertal. And then class 1 and 2, which would be prepubertal, we end up with animals that have infantile tracts or very small tracts that are not ready to be developed or ready to breed yet. Let's see, with fixed time AI, if the cows come into heat after the AI, should they be bred again? It depends what your goals are. And so we have seen with fixed time AI, if the animal exhibits estrus up to 12 hours after the time of fixed time AI, conception rates is still very good. If it goes after that, so if they're a day or two later, then yes, you're going to want to breed them again. But if it is, like I said, we've seen them show estrus up to 12 hours after time of insemination and had really good success. What that's telling you is when you give that injection of GnRH, you should really shut down estradiol production. So those animals that show estrus within that 12 hours, they were so close, you get all the benefits of them showing estrus. And so it really depends what time you're talking about there. If it's within 12 hours, no, you don't need to breed them again. If it's a day or two later, then yes, you're going to want to try to breed them again or realize they probably didn't conceive to the fixed time AI. Any difference in pregnancy rates with different brands of GnRH, prostaglandin with fixed time AI? So I'll answer that part of it first. The first part of that one is no. I have used almost every one of the GnRHs and prostaglandin that's on the market, and we have not seen any difference between them as long as they are used correctly. The biggest difference that I've seen is more on injection site quality. And I'll admit I never thought about it much when I first started things, but we actually try to avoid places where people vaccinate. And the reason for that is scar tissue will actually develop. I actually had a graduate student one time that was diabetic, and we got to talking about it quite a bit. And you don't realize, but the efficacy of a product goes down if you inject it into scar tissue. And so we try to actually walk around the other side of the chute, give them our prostaglandin or GnRH where it's not being, or they're not getting vaccinated. And so we avoid that scar tissue. And so when we do that, we have seen no differences at all. The other thing is making sure if it's a deep muscle injection that you're using 1.5 inch needles and getting it deep in the muscle. So injection site quality has more of an impact. Do you recommend split time, fixed time AI with estrus detection patches? I recommend all of the protocols that are on the protocol sheet. And so it depends what your goals are and what your labor abilities are. The split time AI does a very good job if you are using it and you're wanting to get the best conception rates possible and you have the ability to split the animals and breed them like that. And so it works extremely well because you're breeding the animals that show estrus early and then waiting and giving those that haven't shown estrus more time. And so by doing that, you get more of them bred based off of estrus. And so it does a very good job. So if you have the abilities to do it, it does a good job. Let's see, next down the list, do you prefer Cattle Master over Bovashield? I don't prefer one over the other. It really depends the situation it's in. I don't think there's one product that is better than another. They are all do a good job. It really depends the herd, what your risk exposure to, and everything else. So Cattle Master is a inactivated vaccine, and Bovishield is a modified live. And so taking into the different things I've said, but knowing what your risk factors are, you need to visit with your local vet to know what exposures you might have, which one might do you a better job. So what are your time recommendations for visual estrus detection in the field? I'm going to take that as what times we heat detect. When we're doing studies or even my own cows, we're out as early in the morning as possible, and I'm out there all day because I want to know when they show estrus. And when I stop for evening breeding, depends on what time I'm going to breed in the evening. And I get asked that question more is, when do you decide that I'm going to make the cutoff for tonight's breeding? And it really depends what time you're breeding, in the evening or in the morning. And so if you go back to that curve that Dr. Sacchi had generated, somewhere between 6 and about 18 hours, 6 to 20 hours is where I want to be shooting for 12. And so if I'm going to breed at 8 in the evening and 8 in the morning, then I'm going to stop at noon and at dark. You know, I want to make sure they have at least that 6 to 8 hours before I inseminate them. Now, if you're not out there all the time, you have to use your best judgment on when those animals came into estrus. How soon after calving can you vaccinate cows? Does it make a difference? You can vaccinate cows pretty much anytime after calving. What you're thinking about there, what I'm assuming you're thinking about, is maternal antibodies. That's in the calves. There's data that shows if we vaccinate calves within the first month of after birth, maternal antibodies from the colostrum can interfere with vaccines. But in that study, one of the herds we worked with that has actually done very well with things, they buy 10 dose bottles every 10 cows. When they move them out to grass, that's when they vaccinate. And so then they always have a fresh bottle and they move through them that way. Because we need to make sure, especially if we're using a modified live, that those, as soon as those bottles are diluted out, that they get used. Curious about supplementation, heifers on pasture, and the benefit of increased pregnancy rate. What was the level of protein, energy, minerals, etc. in the supplement? The supplement on that study was actually 5 pounds of distillers per head per day. Is there anything magical about distillers? No. The reason we did that was the South Dakota Corn Council actually funded the study and gave us the distillers. What we were trying to do is to get enough energy into the animals that we did not go through a negative energy after AI. So all of the studies we do, they're on a good mineral program, and we're trying to get enough energy that they go through no negative energy balance. Let's see, is vaccinating replacement heifers at weaning a good plan, or should it be delayed until closer to 45 days prior to breeding? We need to start them around weaning. And the reason for that is we need to build that immunity. One injection of a vaccine is not going to build the immunity. So any of the vaccines that are out there, they should have 2 doses around weaning, one either prior to and one at weaning, or one at weaning and one soon after. Most of the time they're recommended to be boosted 21 to 28 days. And then it really depends on your risk exposure on getting them done pre-breeding and making sure how far pre-breeding. Like I said, we've gone further out. And so, but getting usually 2 to 3 doses into them before that first breeding is where we want to be. Do you recommend any kind of pubertal induction protocol for reproductive tract score 2 or 3 heifers? Really, the only thing you can do on reproductive tract score 2 or 3 heifers is give them time. The reproductive tract score 3s will move on and reach puberty. Reproductive tract score 2s, they're going to be more than 30 days out from reaching puberty. And so really time development, if they're at that and you're trying to get them into a current breeding season, they're going to be tough. Some of them will, and so some of them will continue out, but really it's just a matter of time. Does the time of year of calving have any effect on postpartum interval? There is some data that says it can. A lot of that has to do with nutrition. We need to remember when we're looking at calving interval or calving time and postpartum interval, how nutrition has an impact. And so we need to consider if we calve in the fall and grass quality is going down, it's going to take longer to reinitiate cycles, mainly due to nutrition. Now, there are some breeds and some thought that daylight does have an effect. If we're talking about sheep or other species, it very much does, but in cattle, we don't see it near as much. And so it really is more of a nutritional effect, or at least the data that's out there.
George, there's
Yes.
a couple questions about injection sites.
Yes.
So if
Okay.
you want to address those, there's even a question about injection in the labia.
Okay. So yes, I see a few questions here. So injection site, neck, rump. So the work that has been done on that, when we give a deep muscle injection, so all of our prostaglandins and GnRHs other than luteolized hycon are all deep muscle injections. When you give an injection into the muscle, what it is it's absorbed, it goes through the venous system, to the heart, to the lung, back to the heart, and then finally moves to the tissue. And so it doesn't matter, at least for drug action, whether we give it in the neck, in the rump, in the labia, where we give it, it has to go through that same process. And so by beef quality assurance, we give all of our injections in the neck. But like I said, we use an 18 gauge, 1.5 inch needle. We avoid sites where they've received pre-breeding vaccinations. And so we do everything to make sure that is. But as far as some people saying, oh, it's closer to the ovary, no, actually it's not, because it has to go through the same system. So let's see. This year, I only saved back 2 heifers. Will heat detection be a problem due to only having one other animal to do the riding? So there is a study that has looked at that the more animals in estrus at a single time, you will get more estrus activity. And so when we are looking at detecting estrus, I would definitely recommend you using some estrus detection aids. And in doing so, if you synchronize them, if they both come into heat around the same time, it'll be better. But you will need to watch them closely. But there you can also watch for secondary signs, the mucus discharge, their vulva, things like that. And so, but yes, more animals does make it easier to detect estrus. Do you prefer quarter or half cc frozen in straws? I've used both. I use both of them regularly. I don't really have a preference, one or the other. If we're using quarter cc straws, when I teach AI schools or that, we use forceps to get them out so people aren't using their hands and thawing part of the semen. And so at least the way we do things, there's really not much of a difference between quarter and half cc straws. Let's see. Next, is there any significant difference in fixed time AI pregnancy rates in heifers with the 14-day CEDAR protocol versus the 7-day COSYNC protocol? Could you comment on the efficiency of the 7 and 7 fixed time AI protocol? So when we look at the Beef Reproductive Task Force goes through this all the time, and we look at the data that is there, the recommended protocol sheets are put together for that reason. And what we look at is large numbers across many different situations, and any of those protocols that are recommended by the task force right now, we know work well. Some of the protocols, there are give and take on them. And so if there is increased labor, usually there'll be a little bit better conception rates, but you have to weigh the difference. As far as the 7 and 7 sync, the data that Jordan has done so far that I've seen, it looks good. There's just not a lot of data right now. I know lots of people that are trying it or have made comments about it. As far as published literature or research studies, there's just not a lot out there right now. And so that's why the task force hasn't recommended it. I'm hoping it works good. From his preliminary data, it seems to be. But right now, we just haven't seen a lot of results in anestrus and cycling cows and different environments and stuff. So time will tell on how well the protocol works over time. Let's see, next one. If using a modified live vaccine, are you better to wait until after breeding season than vaccinate 30 days prior to AI? Oh, then vaccinating 30 days prior to AI. One of the things with a modified live is unless those animals have had that modified live within the previous 12 months, if you give a modified live to a pregnant animal, you risk aborting her. And so we need to remember that if we're using a modified live in a pregnant animal, and actually those labels have just been changed within the past year, I think it was, where is it safe in pregnant animals? They say safe as long as it's been used, but the studies, and there's actually university herds that it's been used in where it still caused abortions when they had used it before. And so I am very cautious about using modified live in pregnant animals in that risk. And so if you are going to do it in a modified live, we need to make sure they had that vaccine within the previous 12 months. Just to verify, there is no advantage to deposit semen in the horn that ovulates. What about when using sex semen? So actually, sex semen is where most of that data comes from. When you look back at the literature where they were using sex semen to first began, they were doing deep horn insemination. And what they saw is if they inseminated in the horn that ovulated or the horn that opposite of what ovulated, conception rates were similar. And so the recommendation is to deposit it in the body. One of the things to be careful of is if you do go further down the uterine horn, if you get blood in the reproductive tract, so if you scrape the endometrium at all and you get a little bit of blood, conception rates go down, because you got to remember sperm is a foreign body to the female. And so if there's any blood at all, you hurt conception rates. So the recommendation is put it in the uterine body. The sperm will swim and the uterine contractions will get it everywhere it needs to go. Why isn't the 7 and 7 protocol recommended for heifers? I talked a little bit about that one a while ago. The 7-7 isn't on the protocol sheets right now for even cows. In talking to Jordan, his experience with heifers is he has not had good luck. And so I have not used the 7 and 7 protocol. And so I can't really address what Jordan has been seeing on that. Do you think that estimation of pregnancy age, crown rump length, 30 days after the end of a 90-day breeding season is accurate enough to predict the animals that bred by AI? And so if we're looking at the crown rump length of be 120 versus a 90-day pregnancy, it becomes very difficult. You can pick up some things Is it as accurate as what we do in research where we do 2 ultrasounds? No, it's not as accurate. And part of that is when you're looking at a ultrasound screen, the way I like to describe it is, especially when they're over 100 days, they all look like elephants on the screen. And so unless you come in and you do very precise measurements, which some of those have been calculated out of the crown width, but if you're doing crown rump length, 120-day pregnancy, you're never going to get a full crown rump length on the screen of an ultrasound. And so it really depends how accurate you want to be. I know people who combine that with calving dates and try to get it as best as they can. So would you recommend multi-min at pre-breeding? Again, that very much depends on your environment and what situation you're in. If you think there's some mineral deficiencies, multi-min is very good at getting minerals into the animal at that time. And so it really depends on your environment and what mineral program they've been on before. If they're on a good mineral program year round, it may not benefit anything. If you're in an area where you think you are deficient in something and it's there, I spent several years in South Dakota before moving back to Texas. We couldn't use multi-min because there was actually areas in South Dakota that were already abundant in selenium. And if you would have given them multi-min, you would have made them toxic. And so you really have to know what your area is and what the environment is before you use a product like that to make sure you're not going to make them toxic in any area. Let's see, next, my technician pre-selected candidates based on presence of big follicles. Won't hormones restart the cycle? So would cattle with small follicles at pre-hormone injection also be good candidates? Depends what you're talking about there. If you're talking about like a track score, then he's selecting for animals that have reached puberty prior to starting a synchronization protocol. If you're talking about the ones that will respond to the protocol, then yes, that's one of the things in evaluating protocols that all of us in the area work on is, does this work in an animal that is in the first few days of an estrus cycle or towards the end of the estrus cycle? And that's where some of the pre-synchronization and things like that come into play. And so if he's looking at it for puberty and calling big follicles pubertal and small follicles are the ones that are really pre-pubertal, then no, they won't respond as well. And so it really depends what he's measuring there. But if it's just restarting, yes, the GnRH at the start of a synchronization protocol is going to reset the waves to get good timing there. Let's see. If there is a real hot weather 60 days before turnout of bulls, is there a degrade in semen quality because of the heat? There can be. So heat, the scrotal height and stuff really does a good job dissipating heat. That can be one of the problems if you get bulls too fat because they can't dissipate the heat. And so in doing that, we can have those issues. A really hot spell 60 days before turnout can actually also impact the cow. There's actually research that heat stress on the cows can have negative effects. So both can have negative effects if it's really hot. With the bull, if it's hot enough to impact spermatogenesis, it can actually take up to 60 days for him to fully recover from that. Dr. Sacchi did those studies where he insulated the scrotum so they maintained heat for 3 days and then removed the insulation. And it took about 60 days for them to fully recover. And so from that, it really depends the level of heat and how bad it is, but we can have an impact on both the bulls and the cows in very hot environments. So what is best, 40 million cells per straw or 20 million sperm cells per straw? It totally depends on the bull. Increasing the number of sperm in a straw does not mean better fertility. It Each bull has a maximum fertility. If there is a defect, and I think next month in our monthly seminar, Dr. Joe Dalton is going to be talking, and he will go into a lot of details on compensable and uncompensable semen traits. But increasing the number of sperm in a straw is not going to mean better fertility unless it's a compensable trait that they can get over. And so I'd encourage you to listen to Dr. Dalton's talk next month when he goes into a lot of those details. What is best for sperm, a milk type extender or an egg extender? Both of them are adding in the proteins that are needed to buffer that sperm. And so there's even clear extenders now that do not have milk or egg yolk in them that work very well. And so every company has their own proprietary extender that they've worked on that they know works in their situation. What is best for AI sperm, water thaw or pocket thaw? Definitely water thaw. The reason water thaw is better, and I actually had an undergraduate that was interested in doing this one time, is when you put it in warm water, it almost instantaneously thaws that straw semen. If you pocket thaw, what it does is it gradually thaws and that sperm will start moving before all the ice crystals are gone. Now, what was interesting is when Christy looked at it as an undergrad project, there were some bulls that handled pocket thawing just fine. There were other bulls that totally crashed. And when I've talked to the AI companies about it, they say on average, it's about a 20 to 30% decrease in motility. But what that really occurs is one bull can do it fine and the next one it's horrible on. And so unless you know a bull can handle pocket thawing, you don't want to do it. The reason water thawing is recommended is we know all bulls thaw well at that environment. And so that's what things are set up as. Let's see. We generally just give a shot of prostaglandin, heat detect, and AI. What is your recommendation on the heifers that do not respond? Sell or turn out with a bull? It really depends on what your management is. If you do that, it depends how long you're heat detecting for. If you just give them a shot of prostaglandin, majority of them will show heat in the next 7 to 10 days. But you've got to remember those that were at the beginning of an estrus cycle may not show heat for out to 21 days. So if you're heat detecting for 21 to 30 days, and you're doing a good job heat detecting, those that haven't shown heat are probably not pubertal yet. And so it depends how long of a breeding season you want to give. If they're close, I mean, the bull will pick them up, but then they're going to be at the end of your breeding season. And so I like to put pressure on heifers to try to get better longevity in the cow herd. But like I said, it depends on how long you're heat detecting. If you're just heat detecting for 5 days, some of those that you're missing could have already been cycling and good animals to breed early, but they were just at the wrong stage of the cycle where they don't respond to prostaglandin. Because remember, it only really works between day 5 and about 18 of the estrus cycle. And so those past 18 should be coming into heat on their own, but those in the first 5 days, prostaglandin will not have any effect on it. Any studies out there on reusing seeders when used on 7-day protocol? Yes, there are studies that have looked at reusing seeders. There is still progesterone left in a seeder. We know that. We know it will go out 14 days because there are 14-day protocols. What I like to talk to people is, why are you wanting to reuse the seeder and how are they being reused? And so when you think about it that way, how are they being cleaned? Are they being cleaned? Because we talk about vaccination and the impacts of vaccines and risk factors. If a seeder's not clean, the amount of bacteria it's putting back in. I've also seen seeders that are going to be washed where somebody throws them in a bucket of water and they sit there for a day or two. That white film that forms on top of that water is all progesterone that's being leached out of them from sitting there and soaking. And so if you're doing it in a fixed time AI protocol where we're trying to get tight synchrony, you're adding in a variable that it cannot be controlled by trying to wash them and reuse them. We know when they come out of the bag and are put in, they're consistent, they meet all of the manufacturer's designs and everything else for them, the amount of progesterone in them. If you've used them, you've washed them, and you've put them up, the two things are disease control and consistency, and there's just things that can't be addressed. If you're doing them and heat detecting, so when we've done studies and we've compared different protocols with estrus detection, if an animal shows estrus and is bred at the right time, the protocol doesn't matter. So if you reuse them and you're heat detecting and you don't care if you're breeding extra days or when she comes into heat, then that's a different situation than a fixed time AI protocol. So, but you still need to worry about how well they're cleaned and any disease transmission with them. Please address the expectations of using sex or sorted semen in breeding programs. So if we're using sex sorted semen, I've used both ABS's and ST's product. And so the ST product would be the same that Select Sires or the other companies are using of sorting versus gender ablation. Both products work very well. If cows have showed estrus, the data we have and others would have says that conception rates run somewhere around 90% of conventional semen. So what does that mean? If you use a straw of unsexed semen and your conception rates are 50%, then if you're using sex sorted semen, conception rates would be 90% of that, or 45%. So you are going to give up a little bit. If those animals have not shown estrus, if you're in a fixed time AI protocol, the data that us and others have done says you're going to give up somewhere 40 to 50%. And so conception rates are very bad. In fact, I know one study that conception rates ran about 3% for cows not in estrus using sex sorted semen, where it was significantly higher with conventional semen. So that's where estrus expression and estrus detection do a lot for when you use that product. But either one of them work well when cows have shown estrus. Just realize you are going to give up a little bit. Any good way to ID a cedar that is used the first time versus the second time besides clipping the cedar tail? As far as ID, if they've been used once or not, I mean, the other way, the whole reusing of the cedars came on dairy animals in New Zealand, and what they were actually doing was taking them out of an animal, breeding them, and then putting them back into the same animal to resynchronize them. And what they were doing when they were doing that was literally taking a piece of tape, putting it on the tail of every cedar and labeling it with the animal ID, so it went back into the same animal. If you're just talking about a group of cedars, I don't know of another better way other than putting a piece of tape or something on them. We personally don't reuse them, so I don't have experience with that. With fixed time AI, if a cow, I think I touched on that one earlier. With fixed time AI, if a cow comes into heat after the AI, should they be bred again? If they come into heat soon after AI, they don't need to be bred again. We usually, with fixed time AI, will see cows show estrus within 12 hours. If it's a day or two later, then yes, you need to rebreed them because the semen will not live that long. And so if you're trying to get them bred as early as possible, then they won't. But if they show, if you AI them, this evening and they're in heat tomorrow morning, our data would say that if they show estrus within 12 hours, then insemination conception rates are really good.
George, I think you went over every single question. That's awesome. We actually, I want to remind everyone, and just make an announcement. We haven't advertised yet, but as soon as tomorrow, we're going to start advertising this. But we have a roundtable for next Wednesday, the 24th, where we want to be an Ask the Expert roundtable with the Beef Reproduction Task Force. And the idea is to try and answer as many questions as you guys have. So I appreciate everybody spending the time with us and asking a bunch of questions. George?
The question that just popped in, all of these will be available online. Vitor will get them up on the YouTube channel, and all of them are available for viewing later on too.
Yes, exactly. Every single webinar is being recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. And please make sure that you follow us and subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we post those there regularly. And there's other videos as well. So taking advantage of that. Just the last thing is, as soon as you sign out, you're going to receive a survey that it's about this webinar and the past webinars that addressing some questions about timing and some other things. We're just trying to make sure that we offer programs that really address what you guys want and are available when you guys are available as well. So if you don't mind, there's just a couple minutes. Please make sure to answer to that survey. George, again, thank you very much. I appreciate you spending the time with us tonight. And everybody have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.